My name is Madison Clark. I'm 26 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I watched my beloved grandmother Victoria take her final breath in the small Victorian house she'd called home for 60 years. She was the woman who raised me when my own mother couldn't be bothered, and in her will, she left me that beautiful house filled with decades of memories. But when I arrived to begin cleaning out her belongings, I discovered my mother had already moved in, changed the locks, and was claiming the house was rightfully hers. What happened next would test everything my grandmother had taught me about standing up for what's right. Let me take you back to the beginning of the story because understanding my relationship with my grandmother Victoria is crucial to understanding why what my mother did was so devastating. When I was 7 years old, my parents went through a messy divorce that tore our family apart. My father relocated to Chicago for a new job opportunity, while my mother Rebecca seemed to view her newfound single status as a chance to reclaim the youth she felt she'd lost raising a child. Within 6 months of the divorce, she'd started dating Marcus, a flashy real estate developer who made it clear that children weren't part of his life plan. Instead of choosing her daughter, my mother chose him. One rainy evening, after another fight about her constant absences and late nights, she packed my clothes into 2 suitcases and drove me to my grandmother's house on Maple Street in Sacramento. "Just for a little while, sweetheart," she promised, kissing my forehead as she handed my bags to Grandma Victoria. "Until I get my life sorted out." Those weeks stretched into months, then years, and eventually became permanent. Grandma Victoria never once complained or made me feel like a burden. She was a retired librarian with a passion for oil painting and herb gardening, and her cozy Victorian house became my sanctuary. The house itself was a character in our story. Built in 1924, it featured original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch where we'd sit every evening watching the neighborhood kids play. Grandma Victoria had maintained it meticulously over the decades, updating the kitchen and bathrooms while preserving its historic charm. The backyard was her pride and joy, filled with rose bushes, a vegetable garden, and an old oak tree with a tire swing she'd installed when my mother was young. "Home isn't just a building, Madison," she would tell me as we worked in the garden together. "It's where you're unconditionally loved, where you can be yourself, where someone believes in your dreams." She attended every school play, helped with homework at the kitchen table, and taught me to paint watercolors in her art studio, which was really just the converted sunroom. Throughout high school and college, my mother's visits became increasingly rare. She'd send birthday cards with money, call on major holidays, but the woman who'd given birth to me had essentially chosen her new life with Marcus over any relationship with me. They bought properties together, traveled extensively, and built a real estate empire centered 3 hours away in Los Angeles. Meanwhile, Grandma Victoria was my constant. She drove me to volleyball practice, celebrated when I made the honor roll, and cried tears of joy at my college graduation from UC Davis with a degree in graphic design. When I landed my first job at a marketing agency in Sacramento, I rented a small apartment downtown but visited her every weekend, without fail. 2 years ago, when Grandma Victoria was diagnosed with lung cancer, there was never any question about what would happen next. I moved back home immediately to care for her. Those final months were both heartbreaking and precious. We spent hours looking through old photo albums. I read her favorite novels aloud when she was too tired to hold books, and we had conversations that stretched late into the night. During one of those evening talks, as I helped her into bed, she brought up something that had been weighing on her mind. "Madison, I need you to know that this house will be yours when I'm gone," she said, her voice weak but determined. "I've already spoken with my attorney, James Patterson. Everything is arranged legally." I tried to change the subject, not wanting to discuss a future without her, but she insisted on continuing. "Your mother will probably make a scene," she warned with a knowing look. "Rebecca has always felt entitled to things she never worked for. But I've made my intentions crystal clear in my will. This house belongs to you." She went on to explain her reasoning. While my mother was her only child, Rebecca had chosen to be absent from her life for nearly 2 decades. I was the one who had brought joy and purpose to her golden years. I was the one who knew every creaky floorboard, every story behind the family photographs, every season in her beloved garden. When Grandma Victoria passed away on a foggy Tuesday morning, I was holding her hand, just as I'd promised. The grief hit me like a physical blow. She had been my anchor, my safe harbor, and suddenly the world felt impossibly empty. The funeral arrangements were overwhelming, but thankfully she had pre-planned most details with her typical thoughtfulness. 1 week after the funeral, James Patterson, her longtime attorney, scheduled the reading of the will. The meeting took place in his downtown office, a formal space with dark wood paneling and law books lining the walls. I sat across from my mother and Marcus, the tension in the room palpable from the moment they arrived. James cleared his throat and began reading the legal document. I, Victoria Louise Clark, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my home at 1247 Maple Street, along with all furnishings and personal effects, to my granddaughter Madison Elizabeth Clark. He continued with details about a modest life insurance policy and her art supplies, all of which were also left to me. My mother's face flushed red as the words sank in. "There must be some mistake," she interrupted sharply. "I'm her daughter. The house should come to me automatically." "There's no mistake, Mrs. Henderson," James replied calmly, using her married name. "Your mother was very specific about her wishes. We discussed this arrangement multiple times over the past 2 years." After the reading, my mother cornered me in the hallway, while Marcus lurked nearby like a shadow. "You manipulated her," she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "Taking advantage of a sick old woman. This isn't over, Madison." I was too emotionally drained to engage in her drama. My friend Jessica suggested I stay with her for a few days before moving back into Grandma's house, giving myself time to process the loss and plan for the future. It seemed like sound advice, and I was grateful for the emotional support during such a difficult time. "Are you worried your mom might try something?" Jessica asked as we drove away from the attorney's office. "What could she possibly do?" I replied with naive confidence. "The will is legally binding. Grandma made her intentions clear to everyone, including her attorney." How foolish I was to underestimate the lengths to which a desperate, entitled person would go. I spent 4 days with Jessica, sorting through my emotions and making plans for my new life. I thought about which rooms I might redecorate, how to honor Grandma's memory while making the space my own, and whether to keep her art studio exactly as she'd left it. These plans became a lifeline through my grief, giving me something positive to focus on during the darkest moments. On Saturday morning, I drove to what was now legally my house, carrying fresh flowers for Grandma's garden and groceries to stock the kitchen. I planned to start going through her clothes to donate and begin the process of settling into my inheritance. As I pulled into the familiar driveway, something immediately felt wrong. The front porch, which had always been decorated with Grandma's collection of potted herbs, was completely bare. The rocking chair, where she used to sit reading, was gone. With growing alarm, I walked up the stone pathway and inserted my key into the front door. It wouldn't turn. I tried again, thinking maybe the lock was sticking, but realized there was a new deadbolt installed above the original. Panic rising in my chest, I knocked on the door, first politely, then more insistently. After several minutes, the door swung open to reveal my mother, dressed in expensive workout clothes as if she'd just returned from a yoga class. "Madison," she said with false sweetness. "What brings you by?" "What brings me by?" I repeated in disbelief. "This is my house. Grandma left it to me. Why are the locks changed, and what are you doing here?" She stepped aside with a theatrical gesture, revealing the interior. My heart sank as I saw that the living room had been completely rearranged. Grandma's antique furniture was gone, replaced with modern pieces I'd never seen before. Boxes were stacked against the walls, and there were clear signs that someone had been living there. "Your grandmother and I had a private understanding," my mother said smoothly. "The will you heard was outdated. She changed her mind in her final weeks and decided the house should go to her daughter, as it rightfully should." Marcus appeared behind her, his imposing presence filling the doorway. "Madison, this is a family matter that needs to be resolved between adults," he said condescendingly. "Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly toward the end." I stood there speechless for a moment before finding my voice. That's completely false, I said, my voice shaking with emotion. She was mentally sharp until the very end. I was with her every day. She never mentioned changing anything. Documents can be revised, my mother said dismissively. What matters is her final wishes, which she expressed to me personally during our last conversation. What last conversation? I demanded. You barely visited her. You didn't even call on her birthday last year. I don't have to justify my relationship with my own mother to you, she snapped. This house has been in our family for generations. It belongs with blood relatives, not charity cases. The cruelty of calling me a charity case, when I was the one who had cared for Grandma Victoria through her illness, hit me like a physical blow. I pulled out my phone to call James Patterson, but got his voicemail. It was Saturday and his office was closed. I'm calling the police, I said, but my mother just laughed. Go ahead. We have legal documentation of our right to be here. You're the one who's trespassing. I retreated to my car and immediately drove to the police station. The officer I spoke with was sympathetic, but explained that this was a civil matter involving property disputes. Even with a will, if they're claiming updated documentation, the courts will need to sort this out, he explained patiently. That night, staying at Jessica's again out of necessity rather than choice, I felt completely helpless. Not only had I lost my grandmother, but now the home where I'd grown up, the place filled with our shared memories, was being stolen from me by the very person who had abandoned both of us years ago. James Patterson returned my call first thing Monday morning. When I explained what had happened, his voice turned cold with anger. This is absolutely unacceptable, he said firmly. I can personally attest that your grandmother never changed her will. I would have been the one to handle any modifications. But they claim to have legal documentation, I said, feeling lost. They're lying or they've produced fraudulent documents, he replied. Your grandmother's will is valid and legally binding. However, removing them from the property will require court action. These situations can take time to resolve. The word, time, filled me with dread. How much time are we talking about? It depends on how aggressively they fight, but we're looking at potentially several months. Property disputes can be complex, especially when the opposing party has financial resources. That afternoon, I drove past the house and was horrified to see a "for sale" sign planted prominently in the front yard. My mother wasn't just stealing my inheritance. She was planning to sell it before I could stop her. I immediately called James, who was equally outraged. This gives us grounds for emergency legal action, he said. I'm filing for an immediate restraining order to prevent the sale. No legitimate real estate transaction can proceed while ownership is disputed. While James handled the legal paperwork, I began gathering evidence to support my case. I collected emails and cards from Grandma Victoria that referenced my future inheritance, found neighbors who could testify about our relationship, and documented everything I could remember about my mother's absence from Grandma's life. The Hendersons, who lived next door and had known my grandmother for 30 years, were eager to help. Your grandmother talked about leaving you the house for years, Mrs. Henderson told me. She was so proud of how you cared for her. Your mother barely showed up except when she needed something. Mr. Henderson added, we saw them moving furniture out of the house over the weekend. Looked like they were getting rid of your grandmother's things to make room for their own stuff. This information was devastating but useful. They were not only occupying my property illegally, but destroying evidence of Grandma Victoria's life and our relationship. I documented everything, taking photographs of the for sale sign and noting the changes to the property's appearance. 3 days later, James called with an update. I've filed a lease pendens against the property, he explained. It's a legal notice that prevents any sale while ownership is disputed. I've also requested an emergency hearing to address the unlawful occupation. What's a lease pendens? I asked. It essentially clouds the title, warning potential buyers that there's ongoing litigation about who owns the property. No bank will approve a mortgage, and most buyers will walk away once they see it. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Friday, giving us a chance to present our evidence before a judge. That evening, while organizing my documents, I discovered something I had completely forgotten about. 6 months earlier, Grandma Victoria had asked me to help her learn how to use video calling on her tablet. During one of our practice sessions, she had accidentally started recording while talking about her plans for the house. In the video, she was sitting in her favorite armchair, looking directly at the camera. "Madison, if you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably dealing with your mother's nonsense about the house," she said with a knowing smile. "I want you to know that my decision to leave you this home comes from love, not obligation. You've been my true family." She went on to explain her reasoning in detail, mentioning specific memories we'd shared in different rooms and her hopes for how I would use the space. It was irrefutable evidence of her mental clarity and intentions. I immediately sent the video to James, who was thrilled. "This is exactly what we need," he said. "It shows your grandmother's state of mind and directly contradicts any claims that she was confused or coerced." The night before the hearing, I could barely sleep. Everything depended on the judge's decision. If my mother somehow convinced the court that she had legitimate documents, I could lose not only my inheritance but also thousands of dollars in legal fees. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my anxious mood. Jessica drove me to the courthouse for moral support, and we met James in the lobby. He looked confident, carrying a thick folder of evidence. "Remember," he told me as we walked to the courtroom, "truth has a way of revealing itself. Your grandmother's intentions are clear, and we have substantial evidence to prove it." The hearing began with Judge Patricia Morris reviewing the basic facts of the case. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. My mother and Marcus sat across the aisle with their attorney, David Walsh, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics. "Documents can be revised," my mother said dismissively. "What matters is her final wishes," which she expressed to me personally during our last conversation. "What last conversation?" I demanded. "You barely visited her. You didn't even call on her birthday last year." "I don't have to justify my relationship with my own mother to you," she snapped. "This house has been in our family for generations. It belongs with blood relatives, not charity cases." The cruelty of calling me a charity case, when I was the one who had cared for Grandma Victoria through her illness, hit me like a physical blow. I pulled out my phone to call James Patterson, but got his voicemail. It was Saturday and his office was closed. "I'm calling the police," I said, but my mother just laughed. "Go ahead. We have legal documentation of our right to be here. You're the one who's trespassing." I retreated to my car and immediately drove to the police station. The officer I spoke with was sympathetic, but explained that this was a civil matter involving property disputes. Even with the will, if they're claiming updated documentation, the courts will need to sort this out, he explained patiently. That night, staying at Jessica's again out of necessity rather than choice, I felt completely helpless. Not only had I lost my grandmother, but now the home where I'd grown up, the place filled with our shared memories, was being stolen from me by the very person who had abandoned both of us years ago. James Patterson returned my call first thing Monday morning. When I explained what had happened, his voice turned cold with anger. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he said firmly. "I can personally attest that your grandmother never changed her will. I would have been the one to handle any modifications." "But they claim to have legal documentation," I said, feeling lost. "They're lying or they've produced fraudulent documents," he replied. "Your grandmother's will is valid and legally binding. However, removing them from the property will require court action. These situations can take time to resolve." The word time filled me with dread. How much time are we talking about? It depends on how aggressively they fight, but we're looking at potentially several months. Property disputes can be complex, especially when the opposing party has financial resources. That afternoon, I drove past the house and was horrified to see a "for sale" sign planted prominently in the front yard. My mother wasn't just stealing my inheritance. She was planning to sell it before I could stop her. I immediately called James, who was equally outraged. "This gives us grounds for emergency legal action," he said. "I'm filing for an immediate restraining order to prevent the sale. No legitimate real estate transaction can proceed while ownership is disputed." While James handled the legal paperwork, I began gathering evidence to support my case. I collected emails and cards from Grandma Victoria that referenced my future inheritance, found neighbors who could testify about our relationship, and documented everything I could remember about my mother's absence from Grandma's life. The Hendersons, who lived next door and had known my grandmother for 30 years, were eager to help. Your grandmother talked about leaving you the house for years, Mrs. Henderson told me. She was so proud of how you cared for her. Your mother barely showed up except when she needed something. Mr. Henderson added, "We saw them moving furniture out of the house over the weekend. Looked like they were getting rid of your grandmother's things to make room for their own stuff." This information was devastating but useful. They were not only occupying my property illegally, but destroying evidence of Grandma Victoria's life and our relationship. I documented everything, taking photographs of the for sale sign and noting the changes to the property's appearance. 3 days later, James called with an update. "I've filed a lease pendens against the property," he explained. "It's a legal notice that prevents any sale while ownership is disputed. I've also requested an emergency hearing to address the unlawful occupation." "What's a lease pendens?" I asked. It essentially clouds the title, warning potential buyers that there's ongoing litigation about who owns the property. No bank will approve a mortgage, and most buyers will walk away once they see it. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Friday, giving us a chance to present our evidence before a judge. That evening, while organizing my documents, I discovered something I had completely forgotten about. 6 months earlier, Grandma Victoria had asked me to help her learn how to use video calling on her tablet. During one of our practice sessions, she had accidentally started recording while talking about her plans for the house. In the video, she was sitting in her favorite armchair, looking directly at the camera. "Madison, if you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably dealing with your mother's nonsense about the house," she said with a knowing smile. "I want you to know that my decision to leave you this home comes from love, not obligation. You've been my true family." She went on to explain her reasoning in detail, mentioning specific memories we'd shared in different rooms and her hopes for how I would use the space. It was irrefutable evidence of her mental clarity and intentions. I immediately sent the video to James, who was thrilled. "This is exactly what we need," he said. "It shows your grandmother's state of mind and directly contradicts any claims that she was confused or coerced." The night before the hearing, I could barely sleep. Everything depended on the judge's decision. If my mother somehow convinced the court that she had legitimate documents, I could lose not only my inheritance, but also thousands of dollars in legal fees. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my anxious mood. Jessica drove me to the courthouse for moral support, and we met James in the lobby. He looked confident, carrying a thick folder of evidence. "Remember," he told me as we walked to the courtroom, "truth has a way of revealing itself. Your grandmother's intentions are clear, and we have substantial evidence to prove it." The hearing began with Judge Patricia Morris reviewing the basic facts of the case. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. My mother and Marcus sat across the aisle with their attorney, David Walsh, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics. Walsh presented their case first, arguing that Victoria Clark had changed her mind about the inheritance in her final weeks and had verbally expressed her desire for the house to go to her daughter. He produced what he claimed was a handwritten letter from my grandmother, dated just 2 weeks before her death. James immediately objected. "Your Honor, we request the opportunity to examine this alleged letter. My client's grandmother was suffering from advanced cancer and was barely able to hold a pen in her final weeks." The judge allowed James to examine the document, and his expression grew skeptical as he studied it. "Your Honor, this handwriting doesn't match samples we have of Mrs. Clark's writing from the same time period. Additionally, the paper and ink appear inconsistent with materials she would have had access to while bedridden." He presented our evidence methodically: the properly executed will, witness statements from neighbors, medical records showing Grandma Victoria's mental clarity, and finally, the video recording. When the video played in the courtroom, showing my grandmother speaking directly about her intentions, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Judge Morris asked to speak with my mother directly. "Mrs. Henderson, Can you explain why your mother would have made this video if she intended to change her will in your favor? My mother's composure cracked. She was confused, she stammered. The medications made her say things she didn't mean. According to medical records, she wasn't on any medications that would cause confusion at the time this video was made, the judge replied. Can you provide any witnesses to support your claim that she wanted to change her will? The silence stretched uncomfortably before Walsh attempted to redirect, but the damage was done. Judge Morris had clearly seen through their deception. After reviewing all evidence, the judge made her ruling. Based on the clear documentation of Victoria Clark's intentions and the questionable nature of the allegedly newer document, I am ordering Mrs. Henderson and any persons residing with her to vacate the property immediately. Furthermore, I am granting an injunction against any sale or transfer of the property. I felt tears of relief streaming down my face as the judge continued. The original will shall be recognized as valid, and Madison Clark is confirmed as the rightful owner of the property at 1247 Maple Street. My mother's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. As we left the courtroom, she grabbed my arm. This isn't over, she hissed. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've cost me. I've cost you, I replied, pulling free from her grip. You're the one who tried to steal my inheritance with fake documents. That afternoon, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy, I returned to the house to oversee my mother's removal. The scene was chaotic, with boxes and furniture scattered everywhere as they hurriedly packed their belongings. Walking through the rooms, I was heartbroken to see how much damage had been done. Many of Grandma Victoria's precious belongings were missing, including her collection of vintage books, family photographs, and art supplies. When I asked my mother about these items, she claimed she had donated them. You had no right to dispose of her things, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Sue me, she replied coldly, echoing the dismissive attitude she'd maintained throughout this ordeal. The deputy ensured they took only items that clearly belonged to them, but the house felt hollow and violated. After they left, I stood alone in the living room, overwhelmed by the mixture of victory and loss. Over the following weeks, I slowly began the process of restoring the house to honor Grandma Victoria's memory while making it my own. I found some of her belongings in boxes in the garage, apparently overlooked in their hasty packing. Each recovered item felt like a small treasure. The neighbors were incredibly supportive, sharing their own memories of my grandmother and offering help with yard work and repairs. Mrs. Henderson brought me a box of photographs she had kept over the years, showing Grandma Victoria in her garden and at neighborhood gatherings. She would be so proud of how you fought for this place, Mrs. Henderson told me. She always said you had her strength and determination. 3 months later, as I sat on the restored front porch reading one of Grandma Victoria's favorite novels, I received an unexpected text from my mother. I'm sorry for what happened. I was desperate and made terrible choices.
Can we talk?
The message surprised me, but I wasn't ready for reconciliation. Too much damage had been done, too many boundaries crossed. I had learned that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, and healing sometimes means accepting that some relationships can't be repaired. I never responded to her text, but I didn't block her number either. Perhaps someday we might find a way forward, but it would require genuine accountability from her, not just convenient apologies when she needed something. Today, as I write this story, I'm living peacefully in a house that Grandma Victoria wanted me to have. I've converted her art studio into a home office where I now run my own graphic design business. The garden is thriving under my care, and I've added new plants while preserving her beloved roses. The legal battle cost me nearly $15,000 in attorney fees, money I'm still paying off, but it was worth every penny to preserve my grandmother's final wish and protect the home where I found stability and love. If there's one lesson I want you to take from my story, it's the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult and expensive. Don't let people take advantage of your grief or assume you won't fight back. Document everything, gather witnesses, and never underestimate the power of truth when presented clearly and persistently. Family isn't always about blood relations. Sometimes the people who choose to love and support you are more family than those who share your DNA. Grandma Victoria taught me that lesson, and it's one I carry with me every day in the house where she wanted me to build my future. The Victorian house on Maple Street isn't just my inheritance. It's my foundation for building a life that would make my grandmother proud. And every evening, as I sit on the porch swing and watch the sunset, I can almost hear her voice reminding me that home is where you're unconditionally loved, where you can be yourself, and where someone believes in your dreams. The months following my legal victory were a complex mixture of healing and discovery. While I had successfully reclaimed my grandmother's house, the emotional aftermath of the battle with my mother continued to affect me in unexpected ways. Some days I would find myself checking the locks multiple times, a nervous habit that developed from the trauma of discovering strangers had invaded my sanctuary. I decided to seek counseling to help process the complicated grief I was experiencing. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a therapist who specialized in family trauma, helped me understand that I wasn't just mourning my grandmother's death, but also the final destruction of any hope for a healthy relationship with my mother. Betrayal by a parent is particularly devastating, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our sessions. It forces you to re-examine your entire understanding of family relationships and trust. Your anger is completely justified, but holding on to it indefinitely will only hurt you. Through therapy, I began to understand that my mother's desperate actions likely stemmed from her own unresolved issues with Grandma Victoria. Perhaps she had always felt overshadowed by the close relationship I shared with her mother, or maybe she was facing financial pressures I wasn't aware of. Understanding her motivations didn't excuse her behavior, but it helped me process my own emotions more healthily. Meanwhile, the house itself was slowly revealing more secrets. While cleaning out the basement, I discovered a trunk that my mother had apparently overlooked in her hasty packing. Inside were dozens of letters Grandma Victoria had written but never sent, documenting her thoughts and feelings over the years. Many were addressed to my mother, expressing hurt over her absence and worry about her choices. One letter, dated just 6 months before Grandma's death, was particularly revealing. "Rebecca, I don't understand how we grew so far apart. I watched Madison flourish under my care and wonder what I did wrong with you. Was I too strict? Too lenient? Did I fail you somehow? I keep hoping you'll come home, really come home, not just for visits when you need something. I'm getting older, and I want to make things right between us before it's too late." Reading these private thoughts was both heartbreaking and illuminating. My grandmother had carried guilt about their estranged relationship, wondering if she had somehow failed as a mother. It made my mother's attempt to steal the house even more cruel, knowing that Grandma Victoria had spent her final months hoping for reconciliation. I also found financial documents that shed light on my mother's motivations. Among Grandma Victoria's papers were bank statements showing that she had lent my mother and Marcus over $80,000 in the past 5 years for various business ventures. None of this money had been repaid, and the most recent loan was made just 8 months before her death. This discovery prompted me to contact James Patterson again. Should I pursue recovering this money? I asked during our meeting. James reviewed the documents carefully. "These appear to be legitimate loans, not gifts," he said. "Legally, the debt would transfer to you as her heir. However, collecting on family loans can be extremely difficult, especially when the borrowers have already demonstrated bad faith by attempting to defraud you of your inheritance." I decided to hold onto the documentation but not pursue immediate legal action. The emotional cost of another battle with my mother seemed too high, and I was already struggling financially from the previous legal fees. However, knowing about the unpaid loans helped explain the desperation behind her actions. As spring arrived, I threw myself into restoring the house and garden. The physical work was therapeutic, helping me channel my emotions into something constructive. I hired a contractor to repair the damage my mother had caused during her brief occupation, including refinishing the hardwood floors that had been scratched by their furniture and repainting the walls to match Grandma Victoria's original color scheme. The garden required even more attention. My mother had neglected the plants during her stay, and several of Grandma's prized rose bushes had died from lack of water. I spent weekends at the local nursery learning about plant care and slowly bringing the garden back to life. Mrs. Henderson became my unofficial mentor, sharing tips she had learned from watching my grandmother over the years. "Your grandmother always said that gardens teach you patience," Mrs. Henderson told me as we worked side by side one Saturday morning. "You can't rush growth, and you have to trust that what you plant today will bloom when it's ready." Her words resonated beyond gardening. I was learning to be patient with my own healing process, understanding that recovering from betrayal and grief takes time. Some days were harder than others, but gradually I began to feel more at peace in the house that was truly mine. 6 months after the court ruling, I received an unexpected phone call from a woman named Patricia Collins, who identified herself as a private investigator. "Miss Clark, I'm calling about your mother and Marcus Henderson. I represent several investors who believe they've been defrauded by Mr. Henderson's real estate ventures." My heart sank as she explained the situation. Apparently, Marcus had been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, using new investors' money to pay returns to earlier investors while funding his and my mother's lavish lifestyle. The scheme was collapsing, and multiple lawsuits were being filed. "We have reason to believe your mother was actively involved in recruiting investors," Patricia continued. "We're also investigating their attempt to sell property they didn't own, specifically your grandmother's house. Your successful legal challenge actually helped expose their pattern of fraudulent behavior." This revelation explained so much about their desperate attempt to steal my inheritance. They hadn't just wanted the house for sentimental reasons or even ordinary greed. They had needed to liquidate assets quickly to stay ahead of their collapsing financial crimes. Patricia asked if I would be willing to provide testimony about their attempt to forge documents and steal my property. "Your case demonstrates a clear pattern of fraud and deception," she explained. "It could be crucial in building criminal charges against them." I agreed to cooperate, though the prospect of facing my mother in court again filled me with dread. Over the following weeks, I provided detailed statements about the forged letter they had presented, their unauthorized occupation of my property, and their attempt to sell the house without legal ownership. The investigation moved quickly. Within 2 months, both my mother and Marcus were arrested on multiple felony charges including wire fraud, forgery, and grand theft. The news coverage was extensive, with local media reporting on the real estate Ponzi scheme that had defrauded investors of over $3 million. Seeing my mother's mugshot on the evening news was surreal and heartbreaking. Despite everything she had done to me, she was still my mother, and watching her face criminal prosecution felt complicated. I called Dr. Martinez to schedule an emergency session. "It's natural to feel conflicted," she assured me. "You can feel sorry for the situation while still maintaining appropriate boundaries. Your mother's legal troubles are the consequence of her own choices, not your fault." The criminal trial began 8 months later. I was called as a witness to testify about their attempt to steal my house using forged documents. Facing my mother across the courtroom was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. She looked older, more fragile than I remembered, wearing an orange county jail jumpsuit instead of her usual designer clothes. When I took the stand, the prosecutor walked me through the timeline of events, from Grandma Victoria's death to the discovery of the changed locks to the presentation of the fake letter in family court. I testified clearly and factually, sticking to what I had witnessed without editorial commentary. During cross-examination, my mother's defense attorney tried to portray me as a vindictive granddaughter who had manipulated an elderly woman and then turned on her own mother out of greed. His questions were aggressive and personal, designed to make me emotional and undermine my credibility. "Isn't it true, Miss Clark, that you isolated your grandmother from her daughter in her final years?" he asked. "No," I replied firmly. "My mother chose not to visit. My grandmother's phone was always available, and she was always hoping to hear from her." "But you admit you influenced your grandmother's decision to leave you the house." "I never asked for the house," I said truthfully. "My grandmother made that decision based on our relationship and my care for her during her illness." The attorney continued this line of questioning for over an hour, but I maintained my composure and stuck to the facts. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, I felt drained but proud that I had told the truth clearly and completely. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Evidence presented by prosecutors painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning several years. Marcus had created fake investment opportunities, forged documents, and used my mother as a recruiter to bring in new victims from their social circles. The attempt to steal my inheritance was just one piece of a much larger criminal enterprise. Several of their victims testified about losing retirement savings and children's college funds to Marcus's schemes. Elderly investors described being charmed by my mother at social events and convinced to invest their life savings based on her promises of guaranteed returns. Listening to these testimonies was devastating. I realized that my mother hadn't just betrayed me. She had actively participated in destroying the financial security of dozens of innocent people. The woman who had abandoned me as a child had grown into someone capable of systematically deceiving vulnerable seniors. When the verdicts were announced, both my mother and Marcus were found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Marcus to 12 years in federal prison and my mother to 8 years. As the bailiff led them away in handcuffs, my mother looked back at me with an expression I couldn't read, part anger, part regret, part something that might have been love. That night, alone in the house that had started this entire ordeal, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and closure. Justice had been served, but at the cost of any remaining hope for a relationship with my mother. I called Jessica, who had supported me throughout this entire nightmare. "How are you feeling?" she asked gently. "Empty," I admitted. I know she brought this on herself, but seeing her led away in handcuffs, she's still my mother, you know? Jessica reminded me that feeling sadness didn't mean I was wrong to testify truthfully. "You didn't put her in prison, Madison. Her choices did that. You just refused to let her victimize you." In the weeks following the trial, I began to focus more intentionally on building a positive future. The house renovations were nearly complete, and I had transformed Grandma Victoria's art studio into a bright, modern workspace for my growing graphic design business. Word-of-mouth referrals were keeping me busy, and I was starting to consider hiring an assistant. I also began dating for the first time since college. Through a client connection, I met David Chun, a local veterinarian who shared my love of gardening and old movies. Our first date was a disaster. I spent most of the evening talking about the legal battles and family drama, clearly not ready for romance. But David was patient and understanding, and we gradually built a friendship that slowly developed into something deeper. "I like that you fight for what you believe in," he told me one evening as we worked together in Grandma Victoria's garden. "But I also want you to know that not all families are full of conflict and betrayal. Some people actually support each other." His words hit me harder than I expected. I realized I had become so accustomed to family dysfunction that healthy relationships seemed foreign. Through Dr. Martinez and my relationship with David, I began to understand what normal family dynamics looked like. A year after the trial, I received a letter from my mother in federal prison. It was the first communication we'd had since her conviction. The letter was surprisingly humble and introspective, very different from the manipulative woman I remembered. "Madison," she wrote, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness after everything I've done. The truth is, I was jealous of your relationship with my mother for years. Watching you two together reminded me of what I had thrown away when I chose Marcus over my family. Instead of trying to rebuild our relationship, I let my jealousy and desperation turn me into someone I don't recognize." She went on to explain that therapy in prison had helped her understand the depth of her mistakes. She didn't ask me to visit or even to write back, but she wanted me to know that she was proud of how I had stood up for myself and honored Grandma Victoria's memory. "The house belongs with you," she concluded. "You are her true daughter in every way that mattered. I hope someday you can remember me as I was when you were little, before I made so many wrong choices." I showed the letter to Dr. Martinez during our session that week. "How does reading this make you feel?" she asked. "Sad, mostly," I replied honestly. "It feels like too little, too late." She's acknowledging things she should have realized years ago. Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "You're under no obligation to respond or to forgive her on any timeline but your own. But it sounds like she's finally taking responsibility for her actions. That's significant, even if it doesn't change your relationship." I kept the letter but didn't respond immediately. Instead, I focused on building the life that Grandma Victoria had wanted for me. David and I grew closer, and he began spending most evenings at the house. He loved hearing stories about my grandmother and was enthusiastic about preserving her legacy while making the space our own. 2 years after the trial, David proposed to me in Grandma Victoria's rose garden on a perfect spring evening. As I said yes, I felt her presence somehow, as if she was smiling down on this moment she would never get to witness in person, but had somehow made possible through her love and sacrifice. Planning our wedding brought unexpected joy. We decided to hold the ceremony in the backyard, surrounded by the garden that had been such an important part of my healing journey. Mrs. Henderson helped with the planning, sharing stories about parties my grandmother had hosted in the same space decades earlier. She would have loved this, Mrs. Henderson told me as we strung lights between the trees. She always said this garden was meant for celebrating life's beautiful moments. 3 months before the wedding, I finally wrote back to my mother. I didn't offer forgiveness or reconciliation, but I acknowledged her letter and let her know about my engagement. I also sent her a photo of the restored house and garden, wanting her to see that I had honored Grandma Victoria's memory while making the space my own. Her response came quickly, filled with genuine happiness about my engagement and gratitude that I had written back. She didn't ask for anything beyond continued occasional contact, seeming to understand that our relationship, if it existed at all, would be entirely on my terms. The wedding was everything I had dreamed of, and more. David's large, close-knit family embraced me warmly, giving me a glimpse of what healthy family relationships looked like. As we exchanged vows under the oak tree where Grandma Victoria's tire swing had once hung, I felt surrounded by love from both the living and the dead. Our first year of marriage was blissful. David moved into the house officially, and we began talking about starting a family. The idea of raising children in the same loving environment where I had found stability filled me with joy. We converted one of the spare bedrooms into a nursery, painting it the same soft yellow that Grandma Victoria had chosen for my room when I first arrived as a scared 7-year-old. When I became pregnant with our first child, I felt Grandma Victoria's presence more strongly than I had since her death. I would often find myself talking to her as I worked in the garden or organized the nursery, sharing my excitement and fears about becoming a mother. "I hope I can be half the parent to this baby that you were to me," I would whisper to her photograph on the mantel. Our daughter, Victoria Elena Chin Clark, was born on a snowy December morning exactly 3 years after my grandmother's death. As I held her for the first time, looking into her bright, curious eyes, I felt the completion of a circle that Grandma Victoria had started when she took in a frightened child all those years ago. The house that had been the center of so much conflict and pain had become what my grandmother always intended, a place of love, stability, and new beginnings. Victoria Elena would grow up in the same nurturing environment that had shaped me, surrounded by the same garden, the same neighbors, and the same sense of belonging that comes from being truly wanted. As I write this final chapter of my story, my daughter is taking her first steps across the same hardwood floors where I learned to walk. The house has been in our family for 4 generations now, and I plan to ensure it stays for many more. But more importantly, I've learned that home isn't just about buildings or legal documents. It's about love, commitment, and the courage to fight for what matters most. My mother still writes occasionally from prison, and I respond when I feel emotionally ready. Our relationship will never be what I once hoped it could be, but I've made peace with that reality. Some wounds heal into scars that simply remind you of lessons learned rather than disappearing completely. If you're facing your own family betrayals or fighting to protect what rightfully belongs to you, remember that standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. Don't let people take advantage of your grief, your trust, or your love. Document everything. Seek help when you need it, and never underestimate the power of truth when presented clearly and persistently. The Victorian house on Maple Street will always be more than just my inheritance. It's my foundation, my sanctuary, and now my daughter's first home. Every day I spend here honors Grandma Victoria's memory and validates her belief that love, not blood, makes a family. And that's a legacy worth fighting for, no matter what it costs.